Andy, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again. So, for those who are new to Proton or have just a vague idea of what it is, what is Proton Mail?
Well, I think Proton is a company that is trying to offer the same services as, say, Google, Apple, or some of the other big tech companies you might know, but with a different business model. We simply believe in putting privacy first, giving you control over your data, and we do that by having rigorous encryption across all of our services. So whether it's Proton Mail, Proton Calendar, Proton Drive, or our Proton VPN service, what Proton is an alternative to big tech services that really put you in control of your data.
Okay, great. And so, can you give just a 101 definition of encryption? Maybe you can do it in 30 seconds or so.
This is a tough one. Well, I think encryption is a complicated topic to explain, but it's math, and the rules of mathematics are kind of constant over time. Once they work, they work. I think what is more valuable to explain is what encryption does for you, right? So when we talk about end-to-end encryption, which is what Proton uses in all of our services, take Proton Mail for example. End-to-end encryption, what it does is ensure that we, as a service provider, don't have the ability to read your emails and read your data. And that means I cannot sell your data to advertisers, and I can also not give your data to, say, third parties like governments that may request it. So it's a technical means to ensure the privacy of your communications.
Okay, great. And so when we spoke, and this is really what I want to get into, is that this idea of showing me advertising. I'm using Gmail. The idea of showing me advertising, I don't really mind. And this idea of having the government, be protected. Of course, I don't want the government protecting. So I don't want the government snooping in my email to try to find out what I'm saying. However, I view email as basically a postcard. I know that anything that I write can eventually be, shown up. Can eventually show up in public. And so, to me, it's just a postcard, nothing more, nothing less. And obviously, people can read those. So, why go with an encrypted service like yours for email other than a Gmail?
Alice, can you check your audio on your side, because your audio suddenly dropped? So I don't know if you have a loose, mic or something.
Test. Did that?
No, the level suddenly dropped. But
how's this?
Yeah.
How's this?
Yeah, it's better now. I'll turn the volume up on my end, but it's I wonder if you lose cable or something.
Let me see. Maybe it could be a cable thing. 1 second.
Yeah.
Here we go. Sorry.
Okay, it just got a lot louder.
Yeah.
That work?
Yes. Hold on. What's happening here? I'm just gonna unplug it. Okay. How's this? Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Better.
Okay.
All right.
I guess we're gonna need to have at least one. I guess we need one cut. Sorry about that.
All right. No. This was my fault. Okay. All right. And this is coming through okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So Andy, I use Gmail. I view email kind of as a postcard, right? I send it. I'm fully aware that people can, potentially read it. I don't want the federal government snooping in, or any government snooping into my email. But it's not like I have state secrets in there. And I don't mind if it's something like a Gmail advertises to me. So, and I feel like that's how most people feel. That's why I see most of the emails, at least, that come into me, are Gmail when they're not corporate. So why would someone go with a encrypted email service over that? I guess it seems like it's a lot of effort to switch. So why would someone do that?
Yeah. Well, I think the question is, why should we accept the status quo, right? You're right. Email is a postcard, but why should it be a postcard? The technology to make email not a postcard definitely exists. The encryption is possible. So if you have the choice between sending postcards versus sending encrypted sealed letters, why would you choose the postcard option? And that's really what Proton is about, is to give people this alternative. Actually switching is not very hard. If you want to use Proton Mail today, we have an easy switch tool. You can actually, log in with one click, put in your Gmail information, an old poll, thanks to GDPR, your contacts, your emails, your calendar from Google directly to the Proton ecosystem. So in fact, it's not hard to switch. And I think we shouldn't be so accepting of the status quo that emails have to be, postcards. We must have advertisement in order to get email, and we need to let Google have access to all of our information just to be online. This is, I guess, if you have no choice, you would live with that. But if there is a choice, I don't see why anybody would tolerate that.
Well, I'll give you one example, which is convenience. I mean, if I'm in Gmail, it links to calendar. Sometimes I book a flight and will auto-populate in Google Calendar. The search is really good. I mean, it's created by a search company. Search is good. And I like the interface. So, again, we don't accept the status quo, but the status quo does give us convenience.
Yes, for sure there is convenience, but you're also giving up a lot, right? You're giving up your most sensitive, intimate data. You're opting into a surveillance machine, which has, very negative consequences for society and also for the security of your data. And that is actually Proton's mission. Our goal is to make the user experience functionally equivalent or as close to as possible, where you don't have to give up convenience to also get privacy. I think the kind of, the notion that you need to trade off privacy in order to have convenience, this is ultimately a false notion. And this is one that through technology, we should be motivated to solve that problem. And I believe in the past, there definitely was a gap. But I think as, private technologies, Proton Mail and others continue to develop, you'll see that over time, that gap actually shrinks, right? The search experience, the mail calendar integrations, these are all things that, today Proton can do and will only do better in the future.
So if I get an email from a flight confirmation that goes to my Proton Mail, it will show up in the Proton calendar?
We're not reading your emails to do that right away, but we are now starting to auto-add the ICS calendar invites. So in fact, today the integration is already working where we are adding events directly into the calendar. And this is things we will continue adding more and more of these features. And that's part of Proton's move towards an ecosystem, right? The reason for integrating Mail, Calendar, and Drive together is to actually support those integrations.
Yeah, now you talk about opting into a surveillance machine. We hear a lot of this, and sometimes this language gets alarmist, with surveillance capitalism, for instance. So how much surveillance is actually happening to the average user?
Well, I think it's not so much the surveillance that is actually happening, but the potential surveillance that this enables, right? And if you, for example, look at the amount of data that Google or Facebook or even Apple has on you today, it is far more data than what the East German government had on East German citizens, through the Stasi, right? It's way more.
I'm here in Germany. I was just at the Stasi, the museum in the Stasi headquarters from a week and a half ago, and I was oh, this is all good. Sorry, I was there a week and a half ago. And I was oh, this is all going to be good material to speak with Andy about. Because that level of surveillance was unbelievable. But, that was done to individuals in dossiers that they would then go and use to sort of keep the general population in line. And that's not exactly what's being done here with, ads, showing ads based off of even some of the information that you've sent. It's, and I would say it seems like most people that are emailing or don't have the government reading their emails the same way the Stasi would read and wiretap everything. I mean, they were dressing up as tourists with cameras to take pictures of people in the street. I don't know if that's the same thing.
Well, Google doesn't need to dress up as a tourist in the street, right? Because they're already on your phone and on your devices and scanning all your information anyways, right? They have automatic ways of doing that. And I think the way to look at this is, imagine the real-life version of Google. It's someone who follows you around, listening to all your conversations, writing down everywhere you've been, keeping a record of all your purchases, and putting it into a little notebook. You would never tolerate the real-life version of Google. So why should we tolerate the online version of Google?
I'll give you an example. I mean, by the way, I'm just trying to hash this out because I actually think there's a lot of merit to what you're doing, but I want to make sure that you get the arguments that Google would make, just so that we're able to really get to the heart of the matter. It's not, at the end of the day, the Google that's taking notes on us is not a person. It is an algorithm, and if a Google engineer were to access that notepad of data, which I don't deny they have, they would get fired. So it seems to me like it's a lesser degree.
Well, this goes into the topic of kind of algorithms, right? And what is more responsible, a person or a computer algorithm? I would argue that actually the algorithm is probably the bigger risk, because as we have seen, it can do things that are completely unintended in terms of consequences. And today we're in a world that's run by algorithms, and I would think that actually the person would be able to make a moral judgment. The algorithm simply does what it's trained to do, and the fact that it's an algorithm and not a person on the other end doesn't actually comfort me, and I don't think should comfort us.
So what are the sort of unintended consequences that the algorithms have done when they've gotten a hold of people's data?
Well, let's take social media and Facebook, for example, right?
Okay.
An example of an algorithm is the so-called notion of filter bubbles. So let's say you are a right or left-leaning political person. Well, you will end up clicking on content that more aligns with your views. And guess what? The content that gets the most views and gets the most traction on social media is the stuff from the far left and from the far right. So the algorithm says, okay, you clearly lean that way, and then it inadvertently shows you more and more extreme content. And this, over time, leads to the polarization of society, because people on the right have more right views, people on the left have more left views, and it's the algorithm that's constantly feeding them information to make their views more extreme. So I think this is an example of how algorithms can go out of control, and this is just, I think, scratching the surface here.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call. I mean, that's not. I think filter bubbles. I think filter bubbles have been somewhat disproven. That you do come into contact with a lot of viewpoints from the other side on social media. The thing is, though, and I think you hit on it, that social media does amplify the stuff that's the most radical, and that's the type of stuff from the other side that you see, and it makes you not be able to find common ground with people. We've had a couple of discussions about that here in the show over the past year. But that being said, it's very different. Like, your personal data is, that's part of the business model there. I don't think Gmail, tracking your data is going to make you send more and more extreme views out to people. So what could be the potential unintended consequence here?
Well, I think what Google is doing is not just Gmail, right? They're taking all of your information from diverse sources, which is every single platform that you use, and essentially they're building a profile on you. And then they're using that information to decide, what they show you, what you don't show you, and to kind of, inform your worldview. So when you think about search and advertising, this is basically, control over what you buy, what you think, what political ads you see. This is a high level of control over, our day-to-day lives. And of course, today it's Google. Maybe you trust Google, right? But the data is out there forever.
For the record, I do not trust Google. It's a trade-off for sure.
Yeah, of course. And your information is literally one merger and acquisition from going overseas. I think the classic example of this is the Grindr, the gay dating app that got bought by the Chinese, right, and became a national security issue. So the thing about data online is you can't take it back. Once it's out there, it's out there. And the ways that it can be used and misused in the future is, completely, out of your control. I think when people were signing for Facebook and signing for Facebook groups back in 2010, 2012, they didn't even imagine that Cambridge Analytica could be the outcome of that data. And this is the thing, is that, we don't really understand how some of this data can be used in the future. And we're today freely giving it up. And I think that is, really the behavior that I think we need to take a step back from and say, hey, maybe this is too much. Maybe we should have control of our data instead of just freely, giving it up.
Right. Cambridge Analytica, I mean, these stuff might influence to some extent, like the way that you think, but they're not. It's not like, in that Social Network movie where they're like controlling it. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, depending on who you believe and who you talk to, Cambridge Analytica could have swung some elections, right? And
I think that's highly doubtful. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, it's true. But I think it goes without saying that this data.
I don't think what they did was good, but yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But I think it goes without saying that this data could swing elections, if misused. And Cambridge Analytica, of course, is one example, but you can kind of see this taken to the logical extreme, right? And we don't need to look very far or even imagine too far to see what this extreme looks like. If you look at a country that also has tech giants that are pervasive in everyday life with basically monopoly power, that's China with Alibaba, Tencent, and these other big Chinese tech giants. And there you clearly see an example of what happens if a tech company's data is put at the service of a government actor that is bent on control and supervision of a population of 1 billion people. So this is a logical conclusion. This is the risk of what could happen. And of course, that seems very far away from us, maybe here in Europe and here in the US. But why would you, freely give this power over us out there to the public in a way that we cannot control, right? I think it's something that should concern all of us, really.
Andy, there is a difference, though, between the U.S. and China case, because it's the government, right? At the end of the day, the United States government or governments in Europe aren't going to have population control the same way that the Chinese Communist Party does. So that's where the distinction is.
Yes,
it's the
but
party, really, not the technology.
Yeah.
Or maybe a combination of both, but it starts with the party.
Yes, it always starts with people, but technology enables you to do this, at massive scale and at very high risk, right? I can give you an example of another country that 30 years ago, on paper and also in practice, was a democracy in competitive elections. This was Russia, right? And you see how this can actually shift over time. I'm not saying that in Western Europe we're destined to follow the same trajectory, but there are definitely some countries which in the past you might have considered to be democracies, which today you'd be hard pressed to consider a democracy. And you can see kind of the danger of this data, because this data that's out there today will still be there in 30 years and can potentially be misused. So this is why I think from a society standpoint, privacy does matter. We should care about it because without privacy, you don't really have true freedom of speech, freedom of information, and without that, actually democracy doesn't really work. So I find it as fundamental to safeguarding democracy, in the 21st century, which is the digital century.
That's right. So so you started with email. I get Proton mails, like people sign up to big technology with it. I have an account, though I don't use it very often. Maybe I should use it more often.
Yeah.
Why'd you start out with email? Versus, because I feel like messaging, I use Signal. So and Signal has disappearing messages. It's encrypted. I think that's much better compared to the other alternatives, but email, less of a compelling event for me to move over. So why start with email?
It really comes down to the notion of what email represents. Today, when you look at email, it's not a communication tool. People think it's a communication tool, but actually email as a communication tool probably stopped 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago. What email actually is identity. And if I were to give you the choice between losing your passport or losing your email, losing your email is probably far more inconvenient, because it is the thing that you have online that links together the rest of your online life, your whole digital existence. So when you choose to use email from Google and you use Gmail, what you're doing is not so much using a Google tool to communicate. What you actually are doing is saying, I'm going to give Google control of my identity, because that Gmail account is your Google account. And that is the thing that Google uses to tie the information they have on their entire platform across all their services to your real-life identity. And in some ways, the use of Proton Mail instead of Gmail is to say, I'm going to opt out of this system, and I'm going to have my identity, and I refuse to have a file for myself, in Google. And that's why we started with email, because it's, in my opinion, the highest leveraged way for people to break free of the system.
So what can Google do with Gmail that you can't do? I'm not talking about functionality. I'm talking about privacy-wise.
Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Like they can read our messages, or when you have an encrypted email service, what can't you do that others can't?
Well, from a technical standpoint,
because your selling point is what you can't do.
Yeah. So from a technical standpoint, I would say that Google could actually encrypt all the emails on their system. They could do everything that we do, because technologically nothing prevents them, right? I would say the key difference between Proton and Google is really the incentive structure that is in place. Google is a company that today, is making 90% of its revenue from advertising. And advertising works best when it's contextualized and when it's personalized. So in other words, Google has a $200 billion incentive to really get up to the line of creepy in terms of abusing your data, because that's what makes them money. So when it comes to, say, making advertisers happy as opposed to protecting your privacy, well, the people that are paying $200 billion are the ones that are going to get the final say. So I think the difference is business model and alignment of interest between users and companies.
Okay, but more to the question in terms of like the practically what they can do. So, do they have like product managers that can go in and read your emails? Do they have like an ad system that targets based off of the emails? And can that or can't that happen in Proton Mail?
Well, Proton, for one, is not an advertising business. So, we don't have user profiles. We don't link any information to real-life identities. We're not looking closely at, we're not scanning your information. We're not monetizing any information. We're not serving any advertisements. So, all the things that Google does enable its ad business, we don't do any of that.
Right.
And I think that's a very clear and very big distinction. And we also cannot one day say change our mind and decide we want to do that, because once data has been encrypted with zero access encryption, once your inbox is encrypted, because it's zero access, we don't have the means to say, Proton's been sold, the new owners really want to mine data and do that as a business model. It's not possible to actually decrypt the data after it has been encrypted. So I think it's not only do we not do it today, we are prevented from doing that in the future by the nature of the way the tech works.
So nobody inside Proton can read the emails of people.
Yeah, we have no means. Yeah, exactly. Right. We have no means to decrypt because we simply do not possess the encryption keys that would be required for us to decrypt user inboxes.
But Gmail they can.
Yeah, of course.
How big of an issue is the government? I want to go back to this government question because we talk a lot about. So we've talked about like surveillance state, but we've talked all about that in terms of the context of advertising. Let's talk about it in terms of governments being able to access email. There was the whole Snowden revelations that showed that the government was spying on a lot more of us than we thought. Do you think that's still the case? And how often is the government going into people's email inbox and just reading whatever they want?
I think they're doing it probably way more frequently than we imagine. And if you take the U.S. for example, where Google's based, Google's an American company, right? There's things like national security letters. There's things like FISA courts. There's many ways in which they can, get direct access to people's inboxes and get this information. So I would say actually in the U.S. it's probably quite common because the means to doing it are quite easy. And FISA courts are rubber stamping exercises.
Do you have any data in terms of how is there any publicly available data in terms of how often this actually happens?
Yeah. Well,
like if you're an average user and if you're not in ISIS, like how often is this? How easy is this to do?
Yeah. Well, Google does publish statistics, so they do have data on this, and we know it's in the millions of requests per year.
Okay.
Right. This is the ones that they publish and the ones that they're able to be transparent about. Right. There could also be some that they're simply not allowed to disclose because they received a national security letter. So clearly there are large number of government access requests, and it is something that happens quite routinely. Now, who they're targeting, how they're targeting, are they doing it within the confines of the law? This is hard to say, right? I think Snowden showed that at least in 2013, it was being done on a widespread basis with very active, very practical checks and balances. Maybe it's different today, but I would be skeptical if it has radically changed since Snowden made his revelations public.
Okay. Andy Yen is with us. He is the CEO of Proton Mail. We're going to take a quick break, talk a little bit more about the company that he operates and whether its incentives are different than the other big tech companies' incentives that we've discussed. We'll also take a look at some of the other products they offer, and then going to get into some of your Twitter questions. There were some good questions from Twitter that showed up when I asked for them, so thank you for those. And then we'll talk a little bit about Apple and its decision to encrypt iCloud. So lots of interesting stuff. Don't go away. We'll be back right after this. And we're back here on Big Technology Podcast, second half, our last half of the show for the year. So we're closing out 2022 strong. here with Andy Yen, CEO of Proton Mail. Andy, first of all, why did you start this company? Did you like see what Snowden did and say, okay, I have to create an antidote to that? What was the compelling event to start the company?
Well, I think like many good tech products, ultimately Proton Mail was a service that I myself wanted. Back in 2014 when we first started, if you wanted to have privacy with your email, you didn't really have much of a choice, right? You could self-host your email, which was finding a cloud service provider, which back then wasn't even that common, installing your own email software, and then being the administrator of that. Or if you want to be online, you can go to Google or Yahoo or some of the other companies that all monetize through the same way. So my thinking was simply, there must be a third way. There must be a better way. There must be a way where I can have something that's so easy to use. My parents can figure it out, but at the same time, still preserve privacy. And that was the concept of Proton Mail, was to see if we could bring together the business model, the technology, and also the user experience to make that happen.
Okay, cool. And so when did you found it?
This is back in 2014, so it was about a year after the Snowden leaks, and that, really, I think that really got people thinking, myself included.
Okay, so that sparked you. How many people does the company have?
Today we have slightly over 400 employees
so
around the
it's
world.
a sizable company.
It's grown a lot in recent years.
And your business model, like you're also a company. I mean, Google's a company. You're a company.
Yeah.
So, your objective also is to make money off of email users, just a different way.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important, right? Because if you don't have a sustainable way to make money, actually the business won't be around for a long time. And I think as a user, you shouldn't actually trust a company that doesn't have a way to make money. Now the question is, how do you make money in a way that aligns incentives with customers? And in Google's case, as a Google user, you're not Google's customer. You're actually the product that Google is selling to its real customers, which is the advertisers. And that's a business alignment of interest. And in Proton's case, of course, our users, they actually pay us. So we keep the lights on through the users who pay us. And because of that, my only incentive is to protect user privacy, because that's why they pay us. And I think that alignment is very important to make sure that you can always keep users' best interests at heart.
Okay, so it's a paid product. What has been the growth curve? I mean, I get a sense that as people have become more aware of this, people are more and more moving towards encrypted services. Like, just in terms of messaging on the phone, I never would have thought to use an encrypted messaging app a few years ago, and now almost all of my messaging happens in Signal, like I mentioned. So are you seeing a similar growth curve?
Yeah, well, I think just to come back on your previous comment, it's not exactly a paid product, it's a freemium product. And that means most people actually don't pay us, right? But the power users that want more features will pay us. Like most freemium models, there's a small percentage of paying users. And I think that is very, very important because that ties directly to growth. The fact that it's a freemium model means that we've basically made privacy encryption technology very accessible. So anybody, anywhere in the world, even if they don't have any financial resources, can actually get on the system and get private information, get the private information protected. And this has led to what I can only call very exponential growth. When we started in 2014, there were maybe 10,000, 20,000 people on the platform. Today, if you look at all Proton services, we're talking in excess of 70 million accounts. And most of these came on just in the past couple of years. So I think you're right. There has been a dramatic shift in people's attitudes towards privacy. And there is now more and more demand for services that actually give you control over your data. And I think that's a positive thing. It's long overdue, but it's great that it's actually happening now.
She said most of these came on in the past couple of years. When did you hit 35 million users? Was it like last year or?
This was probably within the last 2 years, let's say.
2 years. Okay.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last thing I want to ask you about your product, then we're going to move on to some Twitter questions. You don't just do email. Actually, when we met, you mentioned that you do like Google Drive-like capabilities. Like one of the things that would prevent me from switching over is the fact that I love the fact that I have Google Docs and all that stuff, but you have a version of that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think I first want to kind of maybe cover the notion of switching. People tend to think of privacy and not private as kind of mutually exclusive, right? Like, if I'm a privacy person, it means I don't have Facebook, I don't have Instagram, I don't have, LinkedIn, I don't use any other services. And I think the more practical way of looking at this is really a coexistence. So I'll give you an example. Of course, I use Proton Mail, but I've got my old Yahoo account as well. And when I'm in the McDonald's, let's say in Zurich, trying to get access to the public Wi-Fi, I'm not giving them my Proton Mail account. I'm giving them my Yahoo account because I know they're going to sell that and it's going to get spammed, right? So I think this idea of private versus not private is kind of a false dichotomy. I think it's a coexistence. People, you can definitely use Gmail.
It's a tough sell to say, hey, let's add one more inbox. A lot of people have like a Yahoo, a Hotmail, a Gmail, a couple of Gmails going through like the difference.
Yeah. So. But if you have so many, what's one more, right? And I think
it's more work.
But
answer that question about the drive stuff because I feel like that's important.
Yeah. So coming to the question of drive, of course, we need to have documents and all the functionality. Now, Google Drive has been out for more than a decade, right? And they have a big head start on us. So of course, it'll take us some time to get all this functionality. But the Drive product, as is out there already today, is actually already doing quite well. We're already past 1 million files uploaded per day, and it's only been a few months since we launched the product. And what Drive is doing is it gives you a way to store stuff on the cloud with end-to-end encryption, and I think that's actually fantastic. It doesn't have document storage yet, but that's of course on the roadmap. And if you say you have a very sensitive document. In the past, you had two choices. You could put it locally on your phone or on your computer or in a USB stick, and that keeps it safe. But if you lose your phone or lose your USB stick, you're screwed. If you're in a different country without access to your USB stick, you're also in trouble, right? So, cloud is, of course, convenient. But the issue with Google Cloud is, of course, then you're giving Google access to all your files. And I think, the innovation really, what makes, Proton Drive super interesting is you keep the privacy. Your data is still confidential, and we cannot decrypt it. But it's accessible anywhere in the world from any device. And I think there definitely is a happy medium that can be achieved there, where you get convenience and privacy at the same time. And this is why we're pursuing that product. And I think it's something that could be very valuable.
So you don't have like a composer yet, but that's something you're working on.
Yes, yeah. It's something that is in progress.
Okay, what's the ETA on that?
It's hard to say, right? We're a community-driven company. It depends on what community wants. And I can tell you from kind of the initial reaction, Twitter, Reddit, and people who have emailed us, they want the composer and the document editor, but a lot of people just want better photo support. So I think we have the balance of two to see what is higher priority.
Talk a little bit about that, about how your community drives what you build. Is there forums or something, or like how does that work?
Yeah, well, it comes back to the history. Proton, at the very beginning, was a crowdfunding project. So it was launched from 10,000 people donating $500,000 to crowdfund Proton Mail.
Not each, right?
No, unfortunately no, but overall, right?
Yeah, okay.
And that was, I think, a super fascinating way to begin the business. And we're today probably one of the only crowdfunding companies that started crowdfunding and then was able to be around and grow over the years.
Actually delivered. Right.
Yeah. Actually delivered on the promise, right?
I'm still waiting for my fridge with the boombox Kickstarter.
Yeah, I remember it's funny because back when we were doing crowdfunding, we were selling what we call lifetime accounts, right? Which of course is very highly speculative to buy a lifetime account for a crowdfunding project that hasn't even launched yet. Right. But I think those people at the price that we sold them at definitely got their money's worth. And being a crowdfunding company means that it's very community driven, and because the community is what pays us. So every product that we build, every feature that we build, it's really driven by community feedback. It's whatever people say they want the most, we build it. So, when they ask for calendar, we did calendar. They asked for file storage, we did file storage. And even today on Drive, it's, through Reddit, it's through Twitter, it's through people contacting us in customer support. It's through people who answer our annual surveys and our polls. Literally, you tell us to do it, and then we're going to do it. And I think that's how, companies should be run. It makes product management, very easy, of course, because my roadmap is very clear, right? It's what the community tells me they want.
This is like the dream of Web3, right? The users become stakeholders, except I don't think you're issuing any of those FTX tokens.
Yeah, I think you don't need scammy cryptocurrency in order to achieve this. You can just ask them
Right.
directly, and even without coins, they'll tell you what they want.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about the news. So Apple is offering encryption to iCloud, and people like Walt Mossberg, I talked about this iCloud loophole where like Apple talked about like what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone, but because iCloud wasn't encrypted, there are different government entities I believe that could have gotten in there. At least that's what I think the argument is. What's your take on the fact that Apple is going all iCloud for the all encryption for the iCloud backup? Good sign.
Yeah, I think of course it's a positive sign. It's probably good for consumers, but I think as with anything that Apple does, you got to take it with a grain of salt, right? And kind of understand their motivations. And at the end of the day, I think the question that we ought to ask ourselves is what does Apple stand for? What is Apple's values, right? And when it comes to privacy in Apple, the way I think about it and the way I've seen it and kind of what their actions have demonstrated is it's privacy when it's convenient and doesn't hurt the bottom line. And I'll give you kind of a quick example of this, right? This end-to-end encryption of iCloud, at least the file storage. I'm not really sure. I would be highly doubtful if Apple will roll this out in China. China is a country where, for example, Apple is already putting data centers with Chinese joint venture partners in order to give Chinese government access to Apple customer data in China. So our relationship with privacy seems to be we'll do it when it's convenient and when it makes us more money. But when it comes to being private or being people first versus profits, profits tends to win most of the time. And there's been many examples in recent years that really shows kind of how they take that approach, right? I think how does Apple define privacy? Apple really defines privacy as nobody can abuse your data except for us, right?
Yeah.
And the real definition should be, and the Proton definition is, no one can abuse your data, period. So I think it's very important when we look at privacy announcements from big tech companies to not let them redefine what privacy means, because that's actually the fastest way to lose privacy.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. There's no way that they're going to end up closing that off to China. I mean, I feel like reporting has suggested that that's basically the whole deal with them, is that there is a backdoor there for the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and then Apple is also not open source, right? So how it works, what it actually does, there's no way to independently verify. So I think that's also something that makes it quite a bit different from other encryption software like Signal, Proton Mail, Proton Drive. These are open source softwares, and that way you as a consumer can be very confident that it actually does what it's advertising to do.
Yeah. Okay. So here is a tweet from Tim Sweeney, who runs Epic Games, notorious Apple opponent. Tim, if you want to come on the show, you're always welcome. He says, Apple's move to support iCloud end-to-end encryption is a great one, provided it's not a gambit to announce this and then offer to trade it away in secret talks with U.S. officials in exchange for their dropping antitrust legislation and enforcement. That timing, ... And then he says, my view is that the proper boundary for absolute privacy, in which a company can't look or listen, even if compelled, is the boundary between personal effects and personal conversations and published information and public conversations. What's your take on what he has to say?
Yeah, well, I think, of course, Epic and Apple have been locked in a fight for a long time. I mean,
they are not friends.
We're also locked in that fight as well, right? Because we also been very vocal in criticizing some of Apple's App Store policies.
Right.
Do I think it's part of some secret negotiation, with the government to trade away? My personal opinion, no, right?
It seems a bit out there, yeah.
Yeah, but I also can't know too much what is happening, behind closed doors. I think it's quite interesting because if you maybe remember back less than a year ago, Apple was saying, we're going to do some special, client-side back-end scanning in order to, make, child sexual abuse materials, let's say detectable by default, and we're going to proactively, send that information to law enforcement, right? So it seems a bit kind of, odd that the same company that was thinking about, proactively reporting their users to the government is now coming around and saying, oh, now we're going to encrypt everything, right? So it's even for a company like Apple, it's a bit of a big turnaround. I think some people are going to get whiplash from that. And Apple is huge. It's based in the U.S. Clearly has a lot of discussions with law enforcement, and there could be things going on behind the scenes. But I would prefer to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I will, yeah. Right. But I will say that Apple's previous privacy moves. If you look at them a bit more cynically, you kind of see what is at play. So I'll give you an example of kind of them locking out third-party trackers, right? Apple said, oh, this is a move for us to protect your privacy. We're going to disable third-party trackers. And of course, Facebook cries foul. But then you dig deeper, and it turns out that Apple's not blocking all trackers. There are some trackers that are still there, and it's the first-party ones. It's the one that Apple controls. And then at the same time, you see Apple building on ads business and pushing ads, into the settings, into other applications that they control in the App Store, right? And Apple's, ad business goes from 300 million in 2017 to 4 billion today, and a projected 30 billion in 2026. So when Apple said locking out third-party trackers, their actual motivation, wasn't privacy. Their actual motivation was, I'm going to, lock out my surveillance capitalism, a competition, so that when I go do ads, I have a clean run and I've already cleaned the field. And so this is why I think, Tim is probably right to be a bit suspicious, and some people are a bit suspicious.
Right. How do you, Andy? Let's go back to the child sexually exploitative material.
Yeah.
How does Proton handle that stuff? Because it seems like folks that would be in that world would want an encrypted service. I mean, it's sort of like you've built the perfect tool for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it doesn't matter whether it's encrypted or not encrypted. Folks out there who are doing this type of abuse are going to use services. They use Google Drive, for example. They for sure use Apple as well. It's an issue that all platforms have to deal with. And of course, when we get reports of such things, it's illegal in Switzerland. We follow the rules around that. But there's kind of this notion that in order to prevent this entirely, you must, disable encryption, or you must backdoor encryption. And the way to think about this is, of course, if you had a world without privacy, it's probably more quote unquote secure, right? But if you ask the people in North Korea that live in such a regime, they probably don't feel more secure. So, as a society, if we are for freedom of speech, freedom of information, and democracy, we also need to tolerate some level of privacy.
Right, but how can you catch people? What methods can you use?
Yeah. Well, short of breaking encryption, there is many different ways. So I'll give you kind of an example. Today, if you were to look at, let's say, some file metadata. So who uploaded the file? Did it get uploaded over Tor IP? What is the pattern of access? How is it being shared? Actually, a lot of this information can, in fact, be leveraged to, give you very accurate predictions of, which accounts, are abusive. And these are techniques. These are not new techniques, right? This was used, of course, for, anti-spam, because how do you know if an email is spam or not spam? And some of these same behavioral techniques, can actually get you quite far. And will it be, let's say, as effective as, checking every single file? No, right? If you want to stop, for example, bombs being sent in the mail, you open every single package and you read it, right? But we don't do that because that is simply against our values of privacy that we accept in society today. And this is exactly the thing. We of course know that probably by allowing encryption, we'll be less good at detecting some of these things, but that's still an overall benefit to society because privacy gives us so much more in terms of freedom and democracy and civil liberties. And that's a balance that I think regulators always need to be very careful about striking.
Yeah. So we got some great questions for you from Twitter. One of them is from Neville Lahiru, and this is a pretty good one. It talks about what are your thoughts on the whole government versus encryption matter, and if there's a practical middle ground to it, especially when the finger's pointed at national security issues? So it builds off of what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Obviously, the government's going to want to have stuff a little bit more open, and there could be national security risks that people are using you admitted you're gonna be a little less good at it. Probably
Yeah.
goes across the board.
Yeah.
But you make a compelling argument for encryption. Is there some common ground that folks can find?
Yeah. Well, I think we are already at the common ground, and this goes back
What
to
is that? Yeah.
yeah. So this goes back to, I think, the incentives of governments, incentives of private sectors, and the role of legislation. When you pass a law today, it's really to fix something that markets are not able to address. That's the main reason for passing a law in a capitalistic economy, right? And take terrorism or even child abuse, right? Is there any tech company in the world, even the most evil one, for example, that would want that on their platform? I would say not. It's a legal, it's a PR, it's a moral and ethical issue. So the notion that private sector companies like Proton, like Apple, like Facebook, you name it, is not already doing the best that they can do to try to tackle this problem is just folly, right? There is no need for government to say, oh, you need to do more on terrorism because everybody is already doing the maximum they can, right? The absolute disaster for any tech company would be to find that their technology was used in the next 9/11. So in that sense, I think there's very common ground in that everybody agrees these things are objectionable, and everybody is doing the best that they can, within technology possible, to tackle that issue. And that's something that I'm not saying that it maybe doesn't let everybody in DC sleep easy at night. Maybe it keeps the FBI up at night, but it's something that we in society at large can feel comfortable and probably confident in because everybody, even at Proton, we have dozens of engineers working full time just on this issue, and so I believe the common ground and the alignment actually is already there.
Okay, great. Going along these lines, another question we had and by the way, shout out to Jay Manchin Wong, who said ask about the iCloud advanced data protection. So we got that in, and now Richard Porter also asks about how Proton and the Swiss authorities interact, and there's this article that he links to where he says that he shows that a court order led to the arrest of a French climate activist when it came to Proton. So what's going on with your relationship with the Swiss government, and do they have undue power over your company?
Well, I think unless your company is based in a boat 15 miles offshore, you are under the jurisdiction of some country, right? So given that you accept you'll be in a jurisdiction of some country, it's a question of picking the jurisdiction. And in Proton's case, we chose Switzerland because it is quite privacy protective. It has a long tradition of privacy, and the laws generally are quite good. But that doesn't mean Switzerland is not Somalia, right? It's not a lawless country where anything goes. And I think Proton as a service, if you use Proton, it's also not, let's say, immunity from criminal prosecution. So in situations where someone is breaking Swiss law, we do have to comply. And actually, this case in this particular case,
with the climate activists?
Well, I'm not even sure the climate activist, to be honest, right?
Okay.
What happened in this case was, there were some folks who had been illegally, squatting a building, and they had done, extensive property damage and have been stealing, theft, right? So the issue here is, your destruction of private property, theft. These are things that actually are illegal in Switzerland, and you can't do that thing, do things like that. Right? When you do something like that, you will get in trouble. Now, what I find interesting about this case is people were so focused on Proton cooperates with Swiss governments, which to me was pretty obvious. But what was interesting is this was actually probably one of the first times that Proton's encryption was tested in court. If you think about this case, people have been destroying a building, they're squatting a building. The police knew who they were, right? They weren't trying to find them. They simply had to go to the address, and they were there. The folks actually had already previously been arrested. So in that case, why did police come to Proton in this case? Well, they were trying to get incriminating information from the emails in order to build a case. And what this case demonstrated, clearly, through the legal system, was even under legal pressure, even under legal coercion, even with the Swiss, government coming down and ordering us, there is no way to break Proton's encryption. There is no backdoor. Otherwise, we would have been legally compelled to use it. And I think it's in many ways, I think it's good to have that reassurance, right? To know that our assurances of encryption have been legally tested, and if these folks have been using Gmail or something else, the outcome will be very different, right? All the evidence would have been there, but in our case, nothing could be decrypted, and I think it proves that this works, and Proton does fight in court. In fact, about a month after this case, we won actually a major legal victory. So what this means is, unless you're based 15 miles offshore, you're in a country, right? But what you can do is change the laws of a country through the way that they're interpreted by fighting court cases. And we actually won a court victory about a month after this case that dramatically limits the amount of information that email providers are required to retain and hand over. And in democracy, you can do that. So it's not like you just have to give in to whatever the government asks. You can sue the government, you can fight them in court, and in many cases, you actually can win, like we did that in that particular case.
Sounds good. Andy, last question for you. You mentioned you have 70 million users. And, compared to Gmail, which has 1 billion plus, it sort of feels like a hobby site. And I'm not saying that's a hobby site, but like the benefits are obvious. The sale is not going very well if you look at the sheer numbers. Why is that, and can that ever change?
Well, if I look at privacy, it's really a bit like electric cars, 20 years ago. The environmental benefits were obvious. The fact that it's the future, it wasn't obvious back then to anybody other than Elon Musk. This is why he's the richest man in the world, right? But at some point, going electric on automobiles becomes inevitable. And I think it's the same for privacy, right? At some point, when the private service is just as good as a non-private service, why would anybody not pick the private service? And just like today, why would you not pick an electric car when everything is basically equivalent, or if not better than the non-electric version? And I think if you look at a service like Proton, where we don't have advertisers, and we can really do everything at service of the users, in the long run, being privacy first actually will lead to a better user experience, because we don't have to make the compromises that Google and other companies are making, to satisfy advertisers. So, if you take the longer view of this thing, I do believe in 5, 10, maybe even 20 years, we will get to a place where people look at this and say, "Wow, this is obvious. Why didn't we go privacy first?" Now, it'll take a while to get there. There's a lot of work to do. Tesla didn't take over the automobile industry overnight. It took 20 years. But if the core, philosophy is correct, and if the alignment is there with the customers, I think this is going to be inevitable, but it will take some time to get there.
Andy Yen, thanks so much for joining.
Yes, thanks for having me. Really a pleasure to be on.
Great chatting.